Hi everybody, thank you very much and welcome to all our Leeds alumni to the 14th annual Leeds Alumni Media Group event. My name's Kate Watkins and I teach journalism at the School of Media, and I also organise all our employability events for students, including weekly talks called Media Futures. This time last year we were enjoying canapes in London. We could have never imagined that 2020 would bring such a dramatic change to our lives, and one that has tested journalism's mettle as much as the medics and the politicians. So sadly there won't be any canapes tonight, but running the event online has meant that alumni from 30 different countries have been able to join us, who otherwise wouldn't have been able to. So that's absolutely fantastic. And thanks to all our panellists for joining us tonight. I'll be handing over to our chair, the other Kate, shortly, who'll be introducing them and discussing how has 2020 changed the media. Now that's going to be until just after 7 o'clock. And then following the panel discussion and questions, there'll be the opportunity to network with other alumni in the room. Don't worry if you haven't worked out how to move tables yet, that will all be explained. And hopefully I'll manage to work out how to get on a table myself. You'll also be able to find out how you can get involved in various volunteering opportunities, but again, that's going to be explained after the panel discussion. So it just leaves me to welcome to the screen Kate Nash, the Deputy Dean and Associate Professor in Media and Communication, who's going to be chairing the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Kate. Hi, everyone. It is so wonderful to be here. As Kate said, my name's Kate Nash. And I am the Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Cultures. I was previously the head of school for the School of Media and Communications at the University of Leeds. In addition to my role as Deputy Dean, I research interactive documentary and will happily go on at length about interactive factual storytelling. And before all that, I started my media career at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, where I was a cross-media broadcaster. So that explains the funny accent. So I am very delighted to welcome our distinguished alumni panel, who are all very well qualified to help us unpack and interrogate the many changes that this year has brought to the news media. So I'm hoping that our panelists are going to appear as I introduce them. So I'm going to start by introducing Kamal Ahmed. Kamal is Editorial Director of BBC News, and he works across news strategy, daily news and planning, analysis, visual journalism and digital content. He is a member of the News Group Board and the Sounds Board. Kamal joined the BBC in April 2014 as business editor from the Telegraph Media Group, where he was executive business editor with responsibility for the Sunday Telegraph's business and economics coverage. Between 2016 and 2018, he was economics editor for the BBC. From 2007 to 2009, Kamal was Group Director Communications at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the regulator charged with upholding and enforcing equality and human rights legislation in Britain. Prior to that, he was Executive Editor News at The Observer, where he contributed to the relaunch of The Observer as a mid-sized full-colour Sunday, which won Newspaper of the Year at the British Press Awards in 2005. Between 2000 and 2004, Kamal was political editor of The Observer, covering Tony Blair's premiership. He's also worked at The Guardian and Scotland on Sunday. Kamal graduated from the Leeds University, and he lives in Hackney, East London. His first book, The Life and Times of a Very British Man, was published by Bloomsbury in 2018. So we're also going to be joined by Anna Doble. Anna is digital editor at the BBC World Service, where she steers online social video and podcast content for English language programs. Before that, Anna was digital editor at Radio 1 Newsbeat and head of online at Channel 4 News. In her current role, she's focused on developing the BBC's reach into new digital audio markets, including India and sub-Saharan Africa. She's pioneered digital communities around podcasts, including for the award-winning Death in Ice Valley and 13 Minutes to the Moon. Anna began her career as a newsreader and reporter in commercial radio in her home county of Yorkshire before moving to London to join Independent Radio News. We're also going to be joined all the way from Canada by David Walmsley. David graduated from the University of Leeds in 1992 with a 2-1, I believe, in political studies which he describes as all the more remarkable since he spent a lot of his final year as news editor of Leeds Student, not to mention being distracted by the extraordinary midweek Polybop. And I have no idea about Polybop, so I might have to ask for some further background on that one. David then worked as a reporter for the Belfast Telegraph, the Daily Record in Glasgow, and in London for the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. He left England in 1998 to help launch the National Post in Canada, the second last national newspaper launched in the world. He has subsequently held executive roles at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, where today he is the editor-in-chief. David is a member of the World Editors Forum, a group of 24 editors from around the world who push for the protection and support of journalism and journalists everywhere. And he is also a founding member of the Trust Project, a global initiative to help the audience identify quality news stories and sources. So we're also joined, last but not least, by Laura Wilshaw. Laura is News at 10 program editor at ITV, having returned to ITV News after a stint as executive producer at Euronews NBC. Her programs have gained national recognition. Most recently, she was shortlisted in the BAFTA News Program of the Year category. Prior to this, she held roles as the head of home news and senior news editor for ITV News, as well as several senior positions at Sky News, working both within the UK and abroad. Laura is a regular participant in awarding judging panels and is also passionate about increasing the representation of women in newsrooms, something she channels into her work as a mentor and previously as a mentee with the Women in Film and Television organisation. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for giving up your time to be with us tonight for this discussion. We have around about an hour for our conversation. Some questions have been pre-submitted by members of the audience. And if you're in the room and you haven't pre-submitted questions, please don't worry. You can still do so using the Q&A function that you should be able to see, hopefully, there in the chat bar. So I'm going to do my best to keep myself across what's happening on the Q&A. So do bear with me. But we'll sort of start off by kind of talking a little bit about the pandemic and how that changed things. Yeah, it's been one of the obvious kind of challenges. And I guess one of the most immediate challenges was how to report this thing. There were so few parallels and so much uncertainty. And how do you kind of balance the need to inform the public with the need to keep things in proportion and perhaps not kind of produce and provoke too much anxiety? So I kind of want to start by I actually ask Laura, if you want to come in on this one, Laura, and how did you get to grips with what was happening as the pandemic hit?
I suppose December, January really realised that this was happening. We have a correspondent based in China, which helped. So she had her ear to the ground about what this was all about. We also have other experts within our newsroom too. So we have a science editor, we have a health editor, our head of foreign news, and all of these people who are constantly keeping across the news as well, we're bringing in their expertise. And although there was a bit of a slow start, I think you'll all agree, it obviously became then a very big story very quickly. And I guess it became obvious to us with our Westminster team too, just how political it was becoming as well. So it didn't take long for it to completely dominate our news agenda as well as the newsroom itself. And then it became a matter of trying to establish the facts around it as far as we knew, the pictures around it as far as we could, because obviously TV news is all about pictures as well as the words. Understanding the health ramifications, the political ramifications, and constantly this was being fed into us as well by what the government was saying and what our teams who have their own sources were saying as well as the facts we were seeing from figures in hospital, anecdotally from people on the ground too. ITV News has a network of local newsrooms, so on our own national editors, local hospitals, local reporters who are understanding anecdotally, and from professionals within other organisations are hearing stuff on the ground too. So it all kind of fed into the machine. And it wasn't long before we had weeks and weeks and weeks and months of coverage that was just non-stop coronavirus, because everything then began being seen through the prism of coronavirus. So any other story was very difficult to tell without seeing it through the prism of coronavirus. So it just dominated from quite early on.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Kamal, can I bring you in here? The BBC obviously has a really distinctive role to play in relation to kind of informing the public, and I'm just wondering how that shaped your kind of coverage of the virus.
Thanks very much, Kate, and just say hello to everyone, and thanks so much for the invitation. It's really lovely to be back with many Leeds alumni and others. Agree with a lot of what Laura said, really. It has been at times somewhat overwhelming. I think when you are in a position where you're leading or helping support and lead a large broadcaster, you realize how much of this job is engineering and is, trucks and pipes and things plugging in and kit, and just keeping the show on the road was at times a very hard job for many, many colleagues. I think what has been amazing, and as you suggested, my career has been in print. A lot of my career has been in print. Is how good the UK journalism has been, and hats off to the amazing coverage at ITV, Sky, Channel 4, Channel 5, others, as well as print journalism. It's been an amazing time to be a journalist covering this story. And I think you're right, Kate, that all of us, I'm sure this is true for Laura, for David, we've all had to tread that line between giving people public information to keep them alive and also properly prosecuting the story. And the balance of those things has changed over time. Certainly that first, when it really hit the UK, as Laura said, we've been covering it as well from China, from around the world. Obviously, Europe was badly hit before we got the full brunt of it. And at that stage, we were just simply trying to explain what this was, and also, of course, ensure that people had the information they needed to try and make sense of it. So that public information part of all of our jobs, I think all of us as journalists knew that we had to do that. As you say, the BBC has particular responsibilities given our funding model and our charter to do that. But thinking back on my career, what is remarkable about what we are going through, if you think about the big stories that, well, I'm very, very old, so not everyone will have covered, but if you go back to the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, 9/11, the Iraq War, the 2008 financial crisis, whatever it might be, it didn't affect you as a human being in the way that this has. We were not only reporting the story, our colleagues were living it, and we had to take care of their health and their safety and be very engaged in the fact that our first responsibility was, yes, to the audience, but also to our colleagues, not just in the UK, but around the world, of whom, of course, there are many thousands. So I think journalism in the UK has done incredibly well on giving that information. I am very proud, of course, of the BBC and what we have managed to do, where we have made explanation. Our biggest ever online content page has been looking up the number of coronavirus cases in your area. Yeah. And it is fast being caught up by what are the local restrictions in my area. And we know that during these type of periods, but actually through all news, actually, this is how we're developing as a news organization. People, yes, they want the news in that slightly traditional sense, but they really want explanation and context. And they want organizations that can cut through a lot of the noise and a lot of the disinformation. And, I believe, of course, maybe I would say this, but I think the BBC has had a very good COVID period, and many, many people have come to the BBC, but they've come to journalism. And I'm very proud of the fact that it is a profession that has really revealed its value, I think, across print, across broadcast, across online to audiences, which I think is a great thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about new audiences coming into to think about journalism. But I want to bring Anna in here and just ask, Kamal kind of mentioned there and this whole idea of keeping people safe. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how the day-to-day task of doing journalism changed to try and keep journalists safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really fantastic point about that we were living the story day by day, hour by hour, like never before, really. Of course, many other stories have impacted directly our staff and our colleagues, but doing it all together and at once, and kind of, because it was a very confusing picture in the early days. I think the fact that most people started working from home, I think early mid-March, across the UK, and certainly my team being a digital team, we were able to transition quite quickly to working from our living rooms and from our kitchens. So it was, as Kamal said, actually the nuts and bolts, the kind of the logistics become the biggest kind of blocker to getting things done. But I think the way that we worked out quite swiftly that we could use quite a lot of the technology we already had. I mean, who knew about Zoom in February, hey? But we had it. We had it. It was already a piece of software that the BBC had to kind of ease, communication between Salford and London and our bureaus in London. So it's amazing how quickly people acclimatise to working in that way. And then it became, on a kind of day-to-day level, how do we actually get footage, material? The kind of, can we get a VJ there question changed, because we don't want to put a VJ into a dangerous situation. We can't send our own people. There is no travel at the moment. So it became a kind of jigsaw puzzle of how can we get the elements together to tell the story. And from my perspective at the World Service, it was about telling the kind of the international picture, perhaps being super aware that people were going through different phases of the pandemic at different times, obviously second waves, first waves, the obvious stuff, but also just things like the hand washing message. We felt possibly in the UK that we'd heard it a little too much by maybe April, May. And yet we were serving audiences in India, in parts of Africa, where it was only beginning to be a thing, the kind of the basics of the public health message needed to be repeated. So in terms of, social media and digital reach, we had to really think about understanding the different phases our audiences were at and serving them correctly when it was needed, and not feeling that we'd repeated ourselves too often. So yeah, so I think in terms of my team, I feel very lucky that everybody acclimatized quickly. We're a digital team. We should be able to work remotely. We weren't reliant on studio technicians and things in quite the same way. But of course, we very much wanted to make sure our colleagues, some of whom were going in and out of the buildings, were free to do so, and that we weren't in their way.
Yeah, brilliant. David, I want to bring you in here because, of course, Anna just mentioned there this whole idea of things going in waves, and people are ahead of the curve and behind the curve. And how has it been from Canada? How have you been? How have you been following? Whereabouts are you time-wise?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation to be here, and it's great to reconnect with Leeds. It's been far too long. The story in Canada is similar, but there were some very interesting lessons because it's a massive landmass and it's dealing with 6 domestic time zones. We are responsible for creating the best content that's relevant to all, but we're actually instructed by some of the behavior where things have gone very well in areas at the beginning where there was a very low level of population density. And we were able to take the message from areas of British Columbia, around the Vancouver area, where they had actually done a very good job early on in sending out a clear message from the public health officials that resulted in them being able to flatten the curve at an early stage. While in the East, where Quebec had its half-term break a little earlier in March than most of the country, they were returning, and the suspicion is they were returning with the virus. And as a result, Quebec experienced something very, very different. We're now 6 months, 7 months on, of course, remote, no one's in the newsroom, but the curve is growing again. But as I think with England and the UK in general, the death rate seems to be less, but the total numbers, especially among the young, continues to be very high. So what we're really trying to offer up is discussion as best we can with our scientific and health and education reporters, and trying to show some empathy towards the mental health crisis as well, with respect to parents as well as employees and that challenge. But the Canadian story is similar, I think, to many countries. It has got very bad pockets but as a whole, it's probably not experienced the same degree. It's certainly not experienced the same per capita death rate that England has.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you've raised some really important questions there, David, about trust and public health, right? So the news has been an important source of information at this time. And I'm just wondering if you can, talk a little bit about how you have, as a journalist, sought to really try and foster trust among the public.
Yeah, I mean, the Globe and Mail is a national newspaper. And so, as I say, we're trying to work with 6 time zones, 10 provinces and 3 territories. And we also have an international strength with our foreign bureaus. But we also have the business model is a metered paywall. So we ask for subscriptions after 4 visits. What we did with coronavirus was we threw it open. We said any content involving coronavirus is a public service good. And it doubled our audience from about 7.5, 8 million uniques a month to 13 million. That 5, 6, 7 million increase has fallen. They've disappeared again. And I think what happened was an initial interest in that demand, that insatiable appetite to understand the content, get a sense of how is this affecting me, but then something else happened. And this is going to be a very important message, I think, in terms of the things we have to learn, and that is the problem of news avoidance, where I think a lot of people, particularly mothers, young mothers, deeply connected to society, very heavily involved in their communities, wanting to do the very best, are saying, give me the information, give me solution-based journalism. We give as much as we possibly can, as fact-based as we can, and they report back to us and say, now you put me in a bad mood. I'm throwing my hands up. I don't know what I can do about this. I'm just going to avoid the news completely. So it's going to be about straddling the growth of that audience and ensuring that people don't feel turned off by what we're offering, which is relentless bad news and exhaustion, but at the same time, giving them the answers that are fact-based. And so we spend a lot of time doing solution-based work, saying, you've heard this, and then we either debunk it or we say elements of it are true. Take the vaccine, for example. I think the headlines yesterday and today are all wrong. They're taking the word of mouth and the desire for a vaccine and giving Pfizer and others the story when the attribution is entirely from the company. We all want a vaccine, but we also have to recognize there's never been a vaccine for a coronavirus. Admittedly, in parenthesis, there's never been this much appetite or interest and concentration in chasing it. But the media, I think, is looking for quick answers sometimes. And that's the Achilles in our industry we have to be careful against.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. I just want to ask Kamal a question here that's been sent in by Victoria Pavlova from London. Victoria asks, it seems that the pandemic has further exacerbated existing political polarization in the UK and the US and across Europe. And have you noticed that in your audience and in your competitors? And does that have an impact on your work?
It'd be nice to, I don't know if we can hear from the people in the room. It'd be nice to hear a bit more about what's behind that. I don't recognize that description. Certainly the evidence is from polling work and from audience research that we've done, is that actually there are people who are in a relatively argumentative frame of mind over what is being described as the economy versus health, which is obviously a slightly cod battle, because if you don't have your health, you don't have an economy. So it's been set up in slightly the wrong way. But let's say there are people who see themselves on putting health first or putting the economy first. They're actually, although they may be argumentative and strongly held views, the broad majority of the people in the UK actually are in a state of mind which is about, tell me the information, tell me what I need to do to stay safe, and help me try and navigate this new world where I may not have a job for quite a long time, or I'm going to lose my job, and what the hell do I do then? So my sense is that the polarization certainly hasn't increased. I've been at the BBC through 2 referendums, one in Scotland and obviously the UK one on the European Union, and through a number of elections. And I think that this has reduced some of that polarization, because this is something that has done, I think, more to knit the UK in terms of what we need to get done than it has to divide it, although it has raised really important issues around powers, around devolved the nations. So I don't quite recognize that polarization, but I don't know if we can, you can talk. I don't know if you can get on the mic here, but I'll just be interested in what you're basing that on. Of course, we have a robust media, which, you know, has arguments and has a sort of elan to it, which I think is part of the understood way that the media reports on events. But I think, as I say, that journalism is really to be praised through this period.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of leads me on to something that a number of people asked, actually, which was about some of the positives coming out of this period, some of the long-term changes. Now, somebody has asked in the chat, Daniel Hipkin, so anyone who wants to jump in here, please do. Will journalists ever go back to newsrooms? Have we seen, is that a permanent change in the way we actually do journalism? I don't know if anyone wants to come and jump in, David.
Thanks, Kate.
Laura.
Yeah, not at the Miami Herald. They closed the newsroom within a month and said, sayonara, you're on your own. Ownership is key. If the ownership believes in the culture of a newsroom, of bringing people together, of the serendipity of a newsroom and overhearing and overseeing moments of connection, then you're going to want a newsroom back. It's not going to happen immediately. And I think we're all surprised at how much we have been able to do remotely. But the newsroom is a very special ecosystem that I would say is an essential ingredient for the growth of, and also the mental well-being of your staff, to have that shared collective gathering.
Yeah. Laura, did you want to come in?
Yeah, my job is still in the newsroom. I can't really do my job from home. I was sent a monitor and a Raspberry Pi, and at the very beginning, when everyone was being sent everything in the hope of us all being able to work at home, it hasn't worked out that way for me. And there are certain people in the newsroom who have to be there if we decide that we're going to present from there. We did try presenting from home as well, and it kind of worked with the connections, but we can social distance enough and be safe enough to be able to do it from the newsroom. But we have screens in the gallery when we're putting out the programme. All the desks are now much further apart than they were before, which actually makes communication a lot harder. But there are certain parts of the job that we'll never go back to. So I used to come into the newsroom for a 9 o'clock editorial meeting every morning, which was a schlep during rush hour to get in for 9 o'clock. My programme's not on air till 10 p.m. Well, I now do that 9 o'clock meeting from home and then go in after that, which means I miss the rush hour. I get to see my son in the morning. I can still have all the same conversations that I would have in the newsroom from home. So there are certain little ways of working that are much improved, but the buzz of the newsroom isn't quite the same as it used to be. And I agree with David, is that there's nothing quite like it. We had a few more people in for the American election night. We had a live program out of Washington for News at 10 and an overnight program. So there were a couple more people in the newsroom, and it was just enough to tilt it to a buzz. And we noticed it. We all said, isn't this amazing? It feels a little bit like old times, even though there were maybe 4 or 5 more people than normal in there, and we are really skeleton. So I don't think the newsroom is dead, and I hope it very much continues to be alive, but I think we can all take from it all the good things that we found about the way that we work to improve our lives as well as the workflows from this, for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Laura. Anna, you wanted to jump here?
I just wanted to add, I agree absolutely with all of that. I think hybrid working is now becoming a reality. We all spoke about it for years, about how we can kind of balance work and life together, and this has kind of forced it to become a part of daily life now rather than a futuristic idea. Just one thing I think is that for young journalists, for people first making their mark in newsrooms, it is essential that we get back into the same offices, even in a kind of flip-floppy, hybrid-y, socially distant way. I think to really pick up and share ideas and show people your talents, you need to be in the same room as them. It's really hard to impress people when everything is on a preordained Zoom or Skype call. you know, the creativity and your talent shine through when you're having ad hoc chats, don't they, when you're making tea and things, and when you're just spinning off an existing thing you're working on and working up something else. So I think all of those conversations that aren't happening in the way we want them to, I think for young journalists, hold on, because we want those chats back. We want to hear from you in an ad hoc way. We don't want to have to kind of set up a formal call every time we have a creative thought. So I sincerely believe we'll get back to that in some form, but it will be different, and our buildings will be very different.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good question in the Q&A actually from Sean Wise, who asks whether, with the pandemic limiting young people's ability to find work experience, which is the most common way to get work, is it time to reevaluate that traditional route to work model in the media? And I don't know if that's something, Anna, you want to come back on?
Well,
or?
I mean, Kamal, you could say it. I mean, let's if we think about normally the restriction to getting work experience and to having an attachment somewhere is, it's boring things. It's kit, it's desk space, it's getting your pass. You know, the whole nonsense about people can't get in and out of the building when they're new. So actually, the friction between kind of getting people involved editorially now is less, I'd say. So arguably, and you know, we'll talk it through, I'm sure, Kamal, but arguably there'll be a way of us having more sort of interaction with you know, potential young journalists who we want to get to know and hear their ideas, because we're all on screens rather than the other way around. I don't know whether Kamal has any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Anna. I think that what it has done, it has broken down some boundaries in the way we gather, and we can now gather in a way that audiences communicate with each other. So on phones and on, you know, laptops, and we can use those mechanisms, which it would have taken us years to get to, because broadcasting, and for good reason, is quite a traditional industry. We sort of know what works for certain audiences, and we do it very well. And we often let go of what works, what we think works, very reluctantly. And I think that what has been proved since lockdown, and since, as you say, Laura, so many people had to leave the office and we had to work in completely different ways and gather in different ways, and we couldn't travel, that has broken down some barriers, and we won't lose that. That notion of porousness with the audience is really important. And so they are seeing often much more authentic sense of people in their own houses. So rather than us arriving with all our kit and our lighting stands and rigs and producers and camera crews and all that, we're just saying, can you just switch on that thing and you'll be with us? And people are just much more relaxed, or can be. This obviously doesn't work for everybody, but can be. And that's a great thing, because we're all looking for authenticity, aren't we? In what we do, and that's much more authentic. I think just on the point of work experience, the industry, I think, not just the BBC, but the industry has slightly moved away from that sort of work experience idea that I certainly grew up, you know, with, that you went in and did a bit of unpaid work, because we know that only advantages certain sort of types of people and skews, you know, towards people who can frankly afford to do that. And we're working, I think, with many other broadcasters and media organizations at having a far more structured, paid way into the media industry, because that helps us on diversity. So I think that, as Anna says, the breakdown of the barriers would actually help that, I hope. And the unpaid for work is now something that doesn't happen at the BBC and doesn't happen at many media organizations.
I think that's really, really interesting and a very, very important initiative. I want to change tack just a little bit and think about who have been the winners and the losers in the kind of media industries and the news media industries as a result of COVID. And I've got a question here, and I think, David, you're going to be the best person to pitch this question to. It was sent in by Andy Juliastri Siafridan, who's in Jakarta, Indonesia, and who I'm hoping is in the room tonight. And Andy asks, given the global pandemic and the lockdown, and given the shift in consumer behaviour, is 2020 lending momentum to the end of print?
Yeah, that's, you know, it's a permanent existential crisis for people in print, that they're about to collapse and disappear forever. And it's been collapsing since before it was created almost. So I don't think that, I think it depends very much on geography. If you, for example, were to look in India, there has never been a greater appetite for print. Their numbers are through the roof. In fact, they have price sensitivity, so they can't charge more than a few rupees, because then the numbers, they actually increase the price because they want the numbers to come down, because it costs so much to distribute the millions of papers that they're doing. If you look at a Western democracy, print has and will continue to be reduced as a medium, because there is a slow but permanent shift towards the digital environment. But the replacement of print is not something that the digital environment has been able to secure yet. One of the interesting statistics we got in the last year is from what we call single copy sales, which is because in North America, the paper is generally delivered to your home, but you can still go into a shop and buy a paper. Those single copies, which are down to design and the news of the moment, actually went up during COVID. The number of people who chose to buy a paper saw us bust budget by over $1 million to the good, even though you've got restrictions around shops and movement, and also that very tactile feeling of holding something that perhaps in the early days people felt was putting them in jeopardy. They didn't want to do it. So print is, there is something I call the serendipity of print. It is suddenly reading about albino rhinoceroses in Kenya that your feed would never have offered to you. But a curated experience remains something that people like to see, particularly on the weekends. I think time is one of the biggest enemies we have. Saturday is the big newspaper day in Canada, Sunday, of course, in England, and also in the United States. And those numbers are very robust. We're actually up about 7% this year. So that's good, but during the week, we're down. So print is a distinct medium. It's not where the big money is, in particular for organizations that are reliant on advertising. They're seeing between sort of 30 to 45, 50% declines. We were down 27%, but we have a digital subscription model that allows us to find the money elsewhere. But if you're wholly reliant on advertising in the Western democracy, you are going to suffer tremendously in print.
Yeah, thanks. I want to know, does anybody want to jump in on who the winners have been in terms of news media in the UK? Kamal, did you want to jump in there? Or Laura, jump in, Laura.
Well, I can certainly say that TV news hasn't suffered at all. We've seen some of the best figures we've had in years, particularly on big events. So Prime Minister locking down, or a particular bit of information. We have seen extraordinary figures across the programs as well. So, we're bulletin led, so different for our news. So people are actually tuning in for a record of the day in ways, people have said that the newspaper industry might be on death's door, and the same has been said about broadcast news too, but there's no evidence of that, certainly through the pandemic for us.
Yeah.
I think that's very true. Yeah, I disagree with Laura. I mean, the linear offer that we've been incredibly, people have been at home, so they've had the TV on and the radio on a lot more than they may have done. So that's been a very important, and it has been those big moments, just like ITN News and the News at 10 would be for ITV. Those big moments have been big, where people come together to watch something. It's had that real sense of the television moment, has been really important. But also we've seen absolutely incredible online figures as well. As I say, some of our, the most popular pages we've ever produced have been produced around coronavirus. As I say, I think journalism has been a winner. Actually, I've been struck by how it has allowed. I think there is a time when sometimes there's too much space to fill in terms of the amount of journalism, and we're sort of producing all this material. I think a lot of people think there's not that much news. Come on, you're fibbing. There's not that much going on. Whereas now, suddenly you're thinking, I can't quite get enough. I think, David, you make a really important point, though, about news avoidance. And we have to think really carefully about, particularly, it's different for Anna, Laura, and myself. If we work for UK broadcasters who have a duty to all audiences. And if there are people who are not engaging with the news, we have to think very, very carefully about why that is and what type of news are we providing. That doesn't mean in any way moving away from the fantastic core offer, but it does mean thinking very carefully about what news really is for people. How often do they have to engage with it? And there is evidence, as David says, that people are exhausted and are turning off from the news, and we have to be very aware of that.
Yeah, there's a couple of related questions, Kamal, that pick up on that. I'm just going to ask one here that's from Jacob Flowers. He was picking up on your point about authenticity. Do you think that having a kind of a greater sense of authenticity within the news might attract new or younger audiences?
Yeah, so we've had I've just been talking amongst colleagues around something that we had planned for a number of weeks to mark the 25th anniversary of the Disability Discrimination Act, and we have a new commissioning group and way of commissioning stories for the BBC, which I chair, and that is all about speaking to the audience about how subjects that involve them, how they would like to see them reported. That doesn't mean that our professional judgment goes out of the window. We just do what the audience tells us. That would obviously be ridiculous. But by listening to the audience, we think that we can create material that audiences will engage with, and particularly audiences that don't come to BBC News sufficiently. And on disability, we had a number of audience-led discussions about issues around disability, how disabled people wanted to see things reported, tell us their stories. And it's about doing news with the audience rather than about the audience. And that's quite a different mindset. I think some of us who are a bit older or a bit further along in our careers, and I think I'm probably by far the oldest here, but anyway, I think we used to, if you imagine when I started out in journalism in the early 1990s, you basically sat in your newsroom. I worked in print. You sat in your newsroom in your castle, and every evening at about 7 p.m. you threw a chunk of paper over the wall, and the audience bought it or didn't buy it. And if they rang you, that was a surprise, and if they wrote to you, that was even more surprising. And that was about all you knew about your audience, apart from the fact they bought the paper, which was hopefully a good thing. Now we have to have much more porous relationships with our audiences. They can contact us all day, every day. They can comment on us all day, every day in social media and other places. And we certainly found with the coverage of the DDA anniversary that having that authentic voice with disabled people really helped it land with disabled people as well as with younger audiences and different audiences, because they can see through construct. People are much more media savvy now than when I was young. They can see through a construct, they can see through a trick, and they want to hear real voices. So I think it really does help us with new audiences.
Yeah. Anna, I want to bring you in here because there's a question here that I think you might be well placed to answer that kind of picks up on what Kamal was saying. It's from Isabel Alderson Blench. She asks whether, if the way we're consuming media is changing, e.g. news, podcasts, and I guess I could add in there, I was reading a paper the other day about TikTok and dancing the news, which I thought was an amazing idea. Are we seeing new forms of news? Do you think these new forms can be monetized successfully, which is possibly not a BBC concern, but...
I think certainly podcasts have shown us a way that we can reach young audiences with proper news content. And, we went through a kind of decade, maybe a bit longer, of thinking that teenage audiences, for example, needed everything, that's every story told at double speed and under a minute. Whereas the podcast market is showing us now that it's not about brevity. Actually, it's actually the opposite. People want depth. It's just that they want a time of their choosing, when they're ready for it, when they're ready to engage. So I think in terms of, kind of the podcast market has shown us that old habit that is perhaps for an older market of like sitting down with the Sunday papers and immersing yourself in kind of magazine stories and longer reads. It's actually the same instincts in a different format. And therefore, yes, if you're looking at monetization models, you need things to actually have enough kind of length and depth to them to insert advertising, don't you? So you were seeing this with, for example, Facebook. For a long time, it was all about short, kind of keep your videos under 3 minutes. And all of a sudden, they kind of moved the goalposts, and suddenly it was better to go a bit longer. not because they wanted our wonderful journalism, I'm afraid, but because they wanted the opportunity with some of our colleagues across the media to insert adverts. So actually depth and meaning and series that break down into 10 parts, things that have that quality of you need to listen again to find out, you know, kind of more about a topic you've now become very interested in. They do lend themselves more to that model. And I think it's the on-demand nature of things. We've seen with BBC Sounds a real spike in younger audiences in the UK and outside the UK coming for news, coming for current affairs discussion, and to understand and to hear voices that they trust. So I'm guessing that that model can be replicated around the industry.
You're on mute, Kate.
How 2020.
Here we go. How 2020. It had to be said once in the event. So there, I'm glad I've done that. I'm conscious of time, so what I'd like to do is kind of wrap up by thinking a little bit about one of the other defining moments of this year of 2020, which has been around the attention that the killing of George Floyd has brought to questions of diversity generally and racial equality. And I guess I just want to throw open to all of our panelists. I don't know if anyone wants to come in and say, I mean, as journalists, I mean, we're not the most diverse bunch. How do we, does anyone know how we kind of successfully attract and retain journalists of colour, journalists from, working class backgrounds, how do we do that? Yeah, David.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to mandate it. If you just leave it to the forces that be, it won't happen. So we've been instructed very clearly by the events of the last year, and so we have now got clear criteria with respect to hiring. At least 50% of the people on shortlists will be Black, Indigenous, or people of color. 35% of all freelance money that is spent will be spent hearing from the voices of those who are underrepresented. That includes Black, Indigenous, people of color groupings, but also disabled and geographic range, which is very important for us because media so often is an urban elite issue or a Eastern Seaboard issue for North America or a Western Seaboard issue. We don't hear from farmers, even though we're all 2 generations from having been on the land. So I think that the thing that cannot happen is you create committees and talk about it. We've all done that. We've done it with the best of intentions and it doesn't work. It doesn't move the needle. My most recent hire is a guy who I've not yet met, but he, to the original notion, would not have had a chance to get in if we didn't have COVID, because COVID had the doors closed to our newsroom. You couldn't get in. We widened our aperture and said, we actually need different people with different stories to tell. This period is the chance to do that. So we recruited a guy who had been on a shortlist previously. And even though we've never physically met, he is spellbinding with his ideas and then the execution, which we can help him with because he's inexperienced. These are marvelous moments, and everyone sees their boats rise with that. So it's down to leadership, though. I mean, that's my responsibility, no one else's. I have to set the tone. And it's very important to me.
Yeah.
I also think that there is just an issue with role models as well. I still think in the media industry, particularly, people in senior positions are most often white and middle class. I think that there is a decent range between men and women. I think gender is less of an issue now than it ever was. But in leadership roles, there's certainly a huge lack. I don't know if you guys would agree in your organisation of diversity.
Yeah, I think getting lots of nods. I've got there are lots of questions on the chat about opportunities right now, opportunities to get into working in journalism. Is now a good time? I mean, I guess perhaps we could wrap up. We've got just a few minutes to share, but I'm just wondering, I've got a question here from Yasmin Watkins in London, and maybe this is one we could kind of all reflect on to kind of end, because it's been asked a number of times. Is there hope for graduating students who are studying media and film and journalism in a post-COVID work experience jobs market? And do you have any advice for people who are going into the jobs market now? So perhaps we can start with Anna. I'm just going across my screen here.
I mean, absolutely, you must have hope, because we need people to feel that they can bring their ideas and stories, and we will absolutely find a place to try and listen and put you in the picture and make you the storyteller. The fact that we live in as I said earlier, an age of screens and things, it will be tricky. It's not as easy as when you kind of inviting someone in to either do a placement with you or indeed to hire. Job interviews aren't quite right on screen either. But as I said earlier, I think actually my advice is always something that I didn't do, which is I didn't specialize. I didn't have a specialist area. I was a bulletin reader on the radio. I was doing all the topics. I was kind of covering my local patch, but I didn't have a specialism. I have specialisms, but I didn't kind of push for them to be the turf that I really owned. So I do think now that we live in a world, the internet is all about many niches, and if you don't know your turf on the internet, you'll get called out very quickly. So actually really work on having a specialist area, and when you come to pitch an idea or indeed come in for an interview or go on Zoom for an interview, just bring it to the fore. Use every opportunity to explain why you have got specialist knowledge, a skill, a passion, because that is in the end what we at certainly the BBC, we want to represent people with loads of different experiences and passions. And in a way, the kind of jack of all trades mentality I had is now a thing of the past, because the diversity of thought and the ideas and the passions we bring to the table are the most important thing. So I do think please have every confidence that there are opportunities for you, and that will create the ways like this tonight of having opportunities to actually meet and talk and share the ideas and start working together, because I do believe that will happen.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Anna. David, did you want to add anything to that? Any last thoughts?
I think, I mean, we obviously represent some of the bigger news organizations, and they're often not the best place to start off a career. It's best to make your mistakes and get a sense of being nurtured rather than thrown in at the deep end. But I think, as Anna says, to reinforce that notion that the internet has really created a democratization for talent. If you go to, say, Spotify, you can create your own podcast. One of the things that I did very badly about 3 or 4 years ago was I asked the crew to set the year's news events to music. I want to create an annual symphony, because I can hear when I see a story, and they're generally very happy or very sad, but I can hear the music with everything. And so we set it to music, but we're not musicians, so we outsourced it to musicians, and it was stunning. We created this album. Who would have thought a stodgy newspaper could do that? So it's about finding the talent that you've got yourselves and bringing it in to say to people, I'm going to take over the Royal Albert Hall. Forget about last night of the proms. This is going to be 2020 set to music. And here's my composition. Do you want it BBC or ITV? Bidding war. Let's go.
I was going to say, Laura, do you want
I've just written your idea down, David. So I'll take that as my own.
I'm obsessed by it. Yes, please. Everyone should do it. Everyone.
I'll just say, I absolutely. It is a time for hope. There are huge changes in journalism, and there's a big generational change as well. I was very fortunate to start in the media in the 90s when it was a real growth industry. And there is going to be a huge change in tone and feel and leadership in the media industry over the next 2 to 5 years. I agree with you, David. I started off sort of small scale. You know, I think I've always found it helpful to learn your trade, so to speak, at a small level. I started on a very small local newspaper outside Glasgow, and I absolutely loved it for 2 years. I learned the importance of the people who bought the paper were my local community, and I had to serve them. And I'm so glad I did that. Just to Anna's point, I think there are lots of different ways into journalism. I think it's absolutely right about uniqueness of who you are and your passions. I'm not absolutely sure about early specialization, Anna. I'm trying to think of people I'm thinking of who are very talented and actually are quite multi-skilled in terms of what they can turn their minds to. It might be within a basket of things or areas. I've always slightly warned against too early specialization. I often find people who, when they're quite early in their career, have a very distinct thing that they want to do. And I've been a frontline reporter, I've been in management, and now in relatively senior leadership position. And I've quite liked that sort of slightly more fluid approach. I've done politics, economics, and business. So I don't know. Anna is one of our most talented leaders. So, you know, far be it from me. But I think that you could also think that an approach which is, I am curious, I'm inquisitive. And the key thing for me is I am about the audience. I am about serving, whether it's an audience or audiences, because they need to know what is going on. Why are we journalists? We are journalists to inform the public so they can make better use of their rights and their life. That is our basic job. And if I can hear that from people, I think that's going to open more doors than anything else.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Laura, have you got any last thoughts for us?
I would just say I wouldn't stress too much about climbing what is seen as the only ladder into journalism through journalism school and then getting work experience and getting your first rung on the ladder. I didn't go to journalism college. I went to Leeds University, and I didn't get my first job in news until I was 29. I'd done various other things before that, and was very late before I really decided it's what I wanted to do. And I started at the bottom, but because of my age, I rose quickly because I had life experience. So there are lots of different ways to get into it. It doesn't have to be that straight ladder up. I think if you can bring your own experience to a job, it makes a big difference.
Fantastic. We are over time. I have not done a good job of keeping to time, but you were also fantastic. So I would just like to thank absolutely all of our expert panelists, and also everybody who sent in questions. I'm sorry we didn't quite get through all of them, but it was wonderful to have your questions there, and I'm sure you'll have a chance to ask them in the kind of mingly, chatty bit that I think we're going to have next.